Hey everyone, this is Kevin. This is going to be a little bit of a different video than what we normally make on this channel because I got news this morning that the creator of Yu-Gi-Oh, Kazuki Takahashi, has died. This was not a natural death. This was very surprising. In fact, his body was found floating um, in an ocean. Apparently, he had been floating for a few days, and he was wearing snorkeling gear. There's an investigation to figure out what caused the death of this beloved manga creator, and we really don't know all the details. Interestingly, as a result, I've been spending most of the morning writing articles about Yu-Gi-Oh! I was working on articles that were waiting to be published that now have new urgency. I had to write the news story about Takahashi dying, and I'm going to be working on the obituary tonight. And it's not exactly something I was... It feels weird, I should say, to be writing these things, because I have a very, very unique connection to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise. Well, maybe it's not that unique, I don't know, maybe I'm making myself seem a little bit more important than that. But here's the thing. Even though it seems kind of silly, even though it's probably not a popular thing to say, the reality is I love Yu-Gi-Oh! And I love Yu-Gi-Oh! Unironically. I actually consider the manga especially to be one of my favorite mangas. Now, I do know what some of the complaints are. I certainly acknowledge it's not perfect. In fact, it definitely gets a little sillier as it goes on and as it becomes more and more focused on card battles. There's a moment where you can kind of look back at the original first several books before the Duelist Kingdom arc came around and remember how much more interesting of a series it was at that point. But even as a card-centric battle manga, it was still far more interesting than most mangas out there. And the way that it all wrapped up with the Millennium World Saga at the end was... It's still one of the best endings to a shonen manga I have ever read, especially one that, after a brief, really interesting beginning, ended up becoming kind of a promotional piece for a card game that is still played by many, many people around the world. But the unique aspect about Yu-Gi-Oh! That I have is that years ago, we're talking, gosh, more than 20 years ago at this point, I created a Yu-Gi-Oh! Website that ended up becoming quite popular. And occasionally, once in a while, someone will recognize my name from that website and say, well, why did you quit doing that website and stuff? And so people still seem to remember it. I don't know really if it's out there anymore outside of the Wayback Machine, but for those of you who are not aware, before I was iCritic, before I was the failed journalist, before I was the Apptrepreneur, before I created the Save Blu-ray 3D blog, before I created the comicbookguy.com, which is another site that's retired, I ran a little website called Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored. Now, unfortunately, the black means things reflect but there it is. Some of you might actually remember seeing this years ago. And it was fairly successful. I got over 140,000 views on this thing. Now, some of you might be scoffing at that, but keep in mind, the internet was a very different time back then. The idea that you could get almost 250,000 views for anything was such a strange concept to even think about. That's why live counters were a thing back then, where it would literally count the visitors that you would get on the website. And most people were happy if they got 700 people who viewed their website. I got over 140,000. That was not something to scoff at. And for 3 years, I updated this little website. And the whole point of Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored was not to show naughty images. In fact, this video will probably get flagged by YouTube because I put Uncensored in the title, even though there's nothing about this video that's particularly, nor was there anything on this site. So, way back in the year 2003, I want to say, is when I created this site. There had been a couple. Well, let me start with the, kind of what was going on with anime at the time. The anime industry was not what it is like today. Back then, there was no Crunchyroll. Heck, back then, there really wasn't even any downloadable anime scene. There was no digisubs. Occasionally, a site would host some episodes of a cartoon. That's how many Sailor Moon fans actually saw their first 13 episodes, or the first 10 episodes of Sailor Moon was on the internet. They would have to spend 2 to 3 hours downloading this 22-minute cartoon, and they'd watch it in very poor quality on the computer. So, suffice to say, the internet was not the force that it was today in terms of distributing content. TV was still the big thing. And in 2002, I believe it was, maybe 2001, a new show premiered on Kids WB, and Kids WB along with Fox Kids, those were the two big sites out there. Those were the not sites. Those were the two big channels out there. Those were what kids watched. Kids WB premiered a cartoon called Yu-Gi-Oh! And I watched it, and I wasn't that impressed, to be perfectly honest. I thought it was honestly kind of silly. I thought the acting was atrocious. It sounded horrible. Like, it made no sense what this show was about, for my opinion, and I decided, I guess it's really not for me. Then a little magazine called Shonen Jump came out, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Was considered the flagship title. That was the title that was going to sell people on buying this magazine, because people had heard of it, and they were giving out a free Yu-Gi-Oh! Card if you bought the first issue, and the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game was popular. I bought the Shonen Jump issue, and I was blown away by what that first chapter was. It was truly nothing like I had expected it to be. Truly nothing. And I immediately wanted to find out more. So obviously I checked out the rest of the manga, but I also started looking on the internet to find information about Yu-Gi-Oh! Had I gotten something about this franchise wrong? Like, how could the comics, which were so interesting, be the inspiration for a TV show that, from my perspective, was so terrible? Well, one site that I did go to was a site that actually is still on the website. It's called Dagasu's Backpack. It is a Pokemon website where the creator compares the differences between the English and Japanese versions of Pokemon. And he writes other articles and reports on things from Japan. It's a very good site if you're a Pokemon fan. Well, he used to accept guest editorials for the website, and one of them was, I think it was called something like Yu-Gi-Oh! The Next Card Captors, and it was by a contributing editor called Alan Tse. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. And in this article, Alan talks about this show that I had seen on Kids WB, and he talks about how horrible it was, and he says, and it's not supposed to be this way. He remembered watching fan subs at an anime club at his high school called Yu-Gi-Oh! And he remembered being very entertained by those cartoons. And so he was, of course, very excited to see it's coming to Kids WB, and yet he watches it and he is appalled. Aside from the voices, which don't seem to match the characters at all, he noticed the music is different. He notices that they've skipped episodes. He's not even sure if it's the first season of the show because he's never seen this before. And he is just blown away by how bad the product is. And that got me thinking, what happened to that show? That's when you start finding out other things about the franchise. There actually was a season of Yu-Gi-Oh! That was skipped. It actually wasn't even a season. It was a series. Originally, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was made by Toei Animation, who you may know for making One Piece and Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon. And they made Yu-Gi-Oh! And apparently this 27-episode series was not picked up for America, but there was a second season produced by TV Tokyo called Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters. And this was the series that 4Kids Entertainment decided to bring to America because, obviously, it would be promoting the cards. 4Kids really had a big vested interest in making this card game a success. And having a TV show to promote the card game would definitely go a long way to helping that out. But here's the thing. 4Kids decided that even though the show was fairly harmless for the most part, at least the new anime, the first series I could totally understand being a little nervous, but the new series was a lot more benign. But 4Kids decided they needed to edit it anyway. Now, there were some things that were a little understandable in hindsight. They had to remove guns from the show. Because of laws, the cards themselves, which I should just leave here because it's getting hard to pick up, couldn't actually look like the card product. It had to look like its own version of the cards. And obviously they're not going to have the characters swear or drink wine or anything like that. I totally would understand that. But then they went above and beyond what needed to be changed. They did start changing character names. They replaced the music. They started adding rules. They started altering the card artwork. They really changed a lot of the show, I found out. And back then, you didn't have access to the uncut version, at least not very easily. You had to import tapes and bootleg DVDs to watch the original version. And I decided I was going to do something that had been done before, but it was kind of a popular thing to do. I was going to create an uncensored site. The concept of an uncensored site started, I think, in 1997 or 98, when a man called Chris Fazaros, if I pronounce that correctly, I'm probably not. He was an adult fan of Dragon Ball Z who grew up watching the fan subs of the show. Now, he admits, yeah, Dragon Ball Z is not the best show in the world, but I had fond memories of it. It was my show. And then I tune in to see this dub of the show, and it is absolutely horrendous. They're cutting things. They're neutering it. They're changing the music. There's no blood. And he decides to make a website called Dragon Ball Z Uncensored, where he will compare the episodes and point out all the changes that have been made to Dragon Ball Z. The site is a big hit. It also highlights issues with censorship in America when it comes to anime. And then a few years later, Sailor Moon Uncensored becomes a thing. A site that I do believe is still up. However, you got to be really careful about searching that term on Google or Bing because you might get some stuff you weren't intending to. I will put all the links to these sites below for any kids out there. Don't go searching these terms. Just use the links below if you want to check out what these sites were. And Sailor Moon Uncensored actually reaches out to Chris Fazaros to see if they can use his web design and just modify it to be Sailor Moon. He says yes, and it happens. Then someone decides to make a Dragon Ball Z Uncensored 2 once Chris decides to retire from making the original site, and of course they use his design. Well, I'm a kid and I have very, very limited HTML skills, so I decide to reach out to Chris as well and see if I can use his design for a Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored. He says yes, and the site is born. Now, I do remember reading comments at the time that people are like, does Chris just get little royalty checks for every time someone uses a site design. It wasn't true. It's because most of the people running these sites were young, they were inexperienced, and they didn't want to design a website from the ground up. So they would, if someone was willing to let us use their design, then, we would use that design. Also, it would kind of make the sites almost look like a little bit of a family, like a series of sites. There were other websites, too, that were under the Uncensored umbrella. Cardcaptor's Uncensored was one of them. And he decided he would not use the Chris Fisaro's Dragon Ball Z Uncensored design template. He would just create his own. Or maybe it's a she. I don't know for sure, to be honest. That person I want to add was very dedicated to the cause. They did like screenshots every other 10 seconds, comparing lines of dialogue. Like, that person was nuts in the most admirable way I could think of. And so I created Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored in 2003. And because uncensored sites were big and Yu-Gi-Oh! Was big, and we didn't have the issue of franchise characters doing naughty things on Google yet, it was pretty easy for this site to gain a following. And I ran the site for 3 years, from 2003 to 2006. Maybe it was 4 years. No, that was 3 years. So, needless to say, I ran it for a while. And then one day, I just kind of decided, you know what? I'm kind of done with this. I no longer want to run Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored. So I wrote at least what it seemed at the time was a very heartfelt final editorial. I passed the website on to my buddy at the time, JD, and I moved on. I went on to create thecomicbookguy.com, which ended up becoming a pretty big success in his own right. I then made themoviewizard.com, which never quite took off. That became iCritic.net, which is starting to finally take off because of this channel. And then, I just made other websites and other YouTube channels, and I've written for a variety of other sites since then. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored was really kind of the first one. I even remember when I started the site, I hosted it on GeoCities. Some of you might not remember what GeoCities was, but it was like a web hosting platform that would give you a certain amount of bandwidth a day for free, and then you could pay for more if you wanted. Well, my site was successful enough that it went down every day. Like, sometimes very early in the morning, this site would go down, and I remember having to take the site and get it hosted on other sites. I didn't come across someone. Like, how do you come across someone on the internet? It's a very interesting thing. But someone by the name of Great Saiyaman 777 came by, liked the site, contributed a couple editorials, and then offered to host my site on a site that he wrote for called the Dragon Ball Z Otaku Alliance, which later became just the Otaku Alliance. And so that's where the site stayed for a very long time. I believe after I had left and after the Otaku Alliance went down, I believe the site moved to a site called Anime Cauldron, and that was the last I'd heard about it. When I search for Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored, I find no place that is hosting the site anymore. It's just the Wayback Machine. And so as a result, the site technically is no longer there. If you want to know exactly how insane this actually was, let me pull up an episode comparison. We would have all the issue. Well, I guess that's not a very good example right there, but we would make these little colored boxes for, like, here's something that's cut, here's a stupid dialogue alert, here's a side note, there would be a note if something was altered. It was all very, very complicated. And even though I didn't design the website, it did teach me how to create some images, how to edit. And so it all it was all very interesting learning experience. Now, at the time, I thought Yu-Gi-Oh! Was the greatest thing in the world, especially uncut Yu-Gi-Oh! I no longer feel that way. I think the show definitely has some problems, and I think some YouTubers have made some very entertaining videos on how illogical and how crazy the whole Yu-Gi-Oh! Universe is. I might even share a few of them in the links below when I'll compile them and I'll share them in the links below. You know, no one's sponsoring me, just feel like doing it. But when I heard that Takahashi died today, I felt a sorrow that I've not felt for too many celebrities. I never met the guy personally. There was one year he was at Comic-Con, and that was the first year of Comic-Con that I decided not to go to. I was obviously very, very upset that I had missed out on that day. But the thing is, also, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga was fascinating and cool because for a kids manga, it was incredibly dark and mature. I've, of course, read better mangas since then. I've seen better shows. I've built better websites. My writing is much better than what it was when I was 13 and 14 years old. And yet, Yu-Gi-Oh! Was a major part of my life. For years, I almost lived and breathed this stuff because the funny thing about owning websites, especially websites about franchises, is even when you're not working on them, you're thinking about them. You're thinking about things you've got to do with them, about where you're going to, what you want to write, you know, what new angle you're going to go for. That's also why you tend to get burnt out after a few years, because you kind of get tired of overanalyzing a show that's made for children, and really it's made to sell cards. So I have fond memories of Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored, but I have not thought about it very much until today. And then I kind of remember what Yu-Gi-Oh! Kind of inadvertently did for me. It got me to kind of make a website and put it out there. It made me interact with people over the internet. It made me have to face criticism on the internet for the first time and realize not everyone's going to like you. It made me seek out original Japanese stuff. It inspired me to check out other uncut versions of shows. It made me write letters to Funimation at the time, who was distributing 4Kids stuff, and begging them, please don't censor your shows. I'm not going to buy them. It made me buy shows that had edited versions on TV. When they had an uncut version on DVD, I would buy it because I wanted to encourage them to release uncut versions of those shows. And I had some good memories with Yu-Gi-Oh! Even if I was complaining about the English version most of the time. Now, once in a while, like I said earlier, someone figures out who I am. And they send an email like, whatever happened to Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored? And it's not a complicated answer. I grew up, and I got older, and I moved on. But knowing that Takahashi's not here anymore, that he's gone. And granted, I know the franchise hasn't really been the same since he stopped personally writing the manga, but the thing is, he still had a hand in certain projects for Yu-Gi-Oh!, and those projects were always a little bit better than when he wasn't involved. The idea that he's not there anymore, it kind of lets me know that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is going to lose its soul. I'm not saying it's not going to be good, but it's going to be kind of like, there's going to be a transitional period, kind of like how the Disney company went through when Walt Disney died. Obviously, the company went on to produce other good movies and stuff, but there was a period where they were lost without their creator, and that's probably going to be Yu-Gi-Oh! For a little while. And for all the things that Yu-Gi-Oh! Did for me, since he was still handling all of that, when I was working on this site, in a strange way, he was inspiring me, and he was helping me, whether he realized it or not. So, this feels like the appropriate time to say the final thing about Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored, and Kazuki Takahashi. Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored was a fun project that I made as a kid that gave me the confidence to try building other things, because I could see that even if it was absolutely silly, I could create something that was mildly successful, and that maybe the next project would be bigger. As for Takahashi, he created, in my opinion, and unironically, a wonderful manga, especially when you factor in the first several books and the last dozen books. That is some really good writing for Shonen Jump. And he's created a game that, I personally don't play that much, but a lot of people love playing this game, and they've made friends playing the game. Like, he made a true mark on the world, and I know some people might even scoff because he created a card game that people like to play, but that card game has brought millions of people together and done so much good in this world that it's sad to think that he's not there anymore to witness it. Like, the creator is gone, while his creation will continue, probably for years to come, to bring joy to other people. And look, Yu-Gi-Oh! Did a lot of great things for my life. Like, I am definitely feeling the loss. If I could have access to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Uncensored website, I would go back and I would write a goodbye article, but I can't do that anymore, so therefore I have to make this video. And on a day when, my hair is giving me trouble, this is why I wear the beanie, folks. My hair causes so much problems. But thank you, Takahashi, for the stories, the game, and the memories. Wherever you are, I hope you are resting in peace and creating new games for whoever is with you in the afterlife. Take care.